You weren't supposed to come." The words fell from my son's mouth as if he'd meant to swallow them, but the damage was done. I heard them clear as the shutter of the camera clicking in the lobby of the Harborfront Grand. My daughter-in-law's arm looped through his, their children pressed to her side, smiling wide for the family photo. I stood just outside the frame, my suitcase handle tight in my palm, the echo of his mutter ringing louder than the chatter of tourists around us. My name is Eleanor Hart. I am 71 years old, a retired librarian, a widow, and until that moment, still a mother who believed she had a place in her son's circle. I have lived long enough to know words spoken under the breath often hold the most truth. That sting carried me back a week earlier to the family group chat on my phone. A family getaway. Daniel's wife had typed, her message dotted with palm tree emojis. Charleston for spring break. Should be fun. The responses came quickly. Daniel sent a thumbs up. His in-laws added their excitement. My invitation, if you could call it that, was no more than a copy-paste into the thread. "No, Mom, I'd love for you to come." Just a casual mention, as if forgetting me would have been the easier option. I hesitated before replying, thumb hovering. I told myself not to overthink. Not to let old insecurities flare, I typed back. "Sounds lovely. I'll be there." No one acknowledged it beyond another thumbs up. Still, I prepared carefully. I packed my sensible walking shoes, a few dresses I hadn't worn since Harold passed, and a sun hat that had survived decades of summers. I booked my flight with money I had quietly saved, unwilling to assume they had included me in their all-expenses-paid promise. In the quiet of my house, I folded each garment with care, though an ache sat in my chest. I knew the difference between being welcomed and being tolerated, but I went anyway, because even when hope is thin as tissue, a mother will chase it. And so I boarded the plane to Charleston, determined to believe this trip could bridge the distance between us, even if I was already bracing for cracks to widen. On the flight down to Charleston, I stared at the clouds pressing against the window and let myself drift back to the years when Daniel was small. His father had been gone before Daniel turned 8 heart attack on a Tuesday morning that left me holding both grief and responsibility in the same trembling hands. There wasn't time to collapse. Bills had to be paid, shoes bought, permission slips signed. I worked days at the library and nights shelving books at the university, sometimes volunteering for research indexing just to pick up a little extra pay. The money rarely stretched far enough, but I made sure Daniel never missed a field trip. I remember sewing patches on his backpack by lamplight so he could take it to Washington, D.C., with his classmates. I'd stayed up all night cataloging archives to cover that cost. When he returned, his face glowed with stories about the monuments. And in that moment, every hour of fatigue felt worth it. Time spun quickly. Daniel grew tall, ambitious, sharper around the edges than the boy who once clutched my hand crossing the street. He studied business, then law, and by 30 he had landed a polished job in a firm whose name sounded like old money, somewhere along the climb. The soft gratitude of childhood hardened into expectation. Now he wore suits tailored in New York and spoke of appearances with the same gravity I once reserved for keeping the lights on. His wife, Madison, matched him step for step, perfect hair, perfect smile, always angling for the right photograph. Around me, she was polite, but never warm. I was the extra piece in their carefully framed picture, tolerated but never truly placed. As the plane descended, I pressed a hand over the thin fabric of my skirt. The woman beside me flipped a glossy magazine, its pages filled with bright vacations and gleaming families. I wondered, not for the first time, when Daniel had stopped seeing me as the woman who built his stepping stones and started seeing me as someone he needed to edit out of the view. The airport was its usual blur of voices and rolling suitcases. Families weaving around one another in lines that never seemed to move. I spotted Daniel and Madison near the check-in counter. Their children perched on matching carry-ons like polished props. Madison's smile flickered the moment she saw me. "Mom." "You made it," Daniel said, his tone more obligatory than warm. His eyes dropped to my shoes, sensible leather flats that had carried me through many long library shifts. "Didn't I tell you to get something lighter? You'll be limping before we land." Madison laughed softly. "Not unkindly, but not kindly either. At least she won't slow us down with heels," she said, adjusting her designer tote. I tightened my grip on the handle of my suitcase. It was a sturdy piece. 10 years old. The wheels squeaking faintly when tilted. Madison's cases gleamed metallic silver, perfectly nested. Expensive enough to pay a month's rent in my old neighborhood. She eyed mine with a glance too quick to be mistaken for accident. I said nothing, swallowing the small sting, and focused on the children. "You two ready for the beach?" I asked. They nodded politely before turning back to their tablets. At security. Daniel sighed when I fumbled with the plastic bins. "Mom." "Really?" he muttered, lifting my bag onto the belt as if it were a burden. I murmured thanks. But his words stayed lodged in my chest. Once we boarded, I found my seat a few rows behind them. They hadn't offered to switch or sit together. I settled in, smoothing the creases of my skirt, and reached for the glossy resort brochure tucked into the seat pocket. The images were dazzling Charleston Harbor stretched like glass under the morning sun. The harborfront Grand's white balconies rising like a castle above the water. Couples smiled over champagne flutes, children splashed in turquoise pools. I traced the photo with my finger, imagining myself among them, imagining laughter shared without sharp edges, despite the morning's small humiliations. I let hope take root again, fragile but insistent. Perhaps in that grand setting, even fractured families could find a way back together. The wheels touched down with a bump, and soon we were weaving through Charleston streets in a shuttle bus that smelled faintly of salt air and sunscreen. Out the window. Pastel row houses lined the avenues, their shutters painted blues and greens soft as sea glass. Spanish moss hung heavy from the live oaks, swaying in the breeze like lace pulled from an old trunk. Cobblestones gleamed faintly after a brief shower, uneven and stubborn, like the city's way of reminding travelers of its long memory. I pressed my hand to the glass, letting the beauty wash over me for a moment. It quieted the ache that had lingered since the airport. Charleston had always carried a dignity in its bones, a kind of resilience I envied. When the shuttle turned, the harborfront Grand came into view. It rose white against the sky, balconies stacked like tiers of a wedding cake, flags fluttering in crisp lines. As we rolled to a stop under the portico, a doorman in a navy jacket opened the door with a polished bow. Daniel stepped off first, Madison behind him. Their children giggling as they skipped across the marble entry. I followed slowly, drinking it in the fountains arcing high, the scent of jasmine carried in from the garden. Inside, the lobby spread wide and cool, marble floors gleaming underfoot. A chandelier hung from the vaulted ceiling, dripping light like captured stars. To one side, a massive floral arrangement spilled over with lilies and orchids, perfuming the air. Guests clustered in small groups, their voices softened by the expanse. I tilted my head back, overwhelmed by the grandeur. My heart fluttered, not with envy, but with possibility. If any place could soften Daniel's edges, if any setting could coax us into laughter free of tension, surely it was here. I clutched the strap of my handbag, steadying myself with the thought that perhaps, just perhaps, beauty like this could hold us together. Lawn, Chapter 5. The Empty Space. The check-in counter gleamed like polished stone, its brass accents catching the light of the chandelier above. Families clustered in loose lines, voices echoing against the marble. Daniel approached first, Madison at his side, their smiles poised for the receptionist as though this were another photo opportunity. "Reservation for Hart," Daniel said smoothly. The clerk typed, nodded, and slid 2 key cards across with a professional smile. "Yes. Mr. Hart, your Harborview suite is ready. Welcome to the Harborfront Grand." Daniel pocketed the cards with a satisfied nod. Madison leaned toward him, whispering something that made her lips curve into a private smile. I waited a step behind, suitcase handle gripped tightly in my hand. When it was my turn, I stepped forward, heart fluttering with quiet anticipation. Reservation for Eleanor Hart. The clerk's fingers moved over the keyboard. Her smile held for a moment, then faltered. She typed again, brows knitting. "I'm sorry. Ms. Hart? I don't seem to find a reservation under that name. Perhaps it was booked separately." Heat crept up my neck. "No, I'm with them. Daniel Hart and his family. We were invited together." I gestured toward Daniel, who stood a few feet away, studying a lobby map with exaggerated interest. The clerk tried again, lips pressing into a thin line. "I do see Mr. and Mrs. Hart here, but I don't have any additional guest under your name." I turned toward my son, words stumbling out. "Daniel, could you?" He shrugged, as if this were a minor inconvenience. "Looks like there was a mix-up. Mom, these things happen." His tone was casual, his eyes fixed anywhere but mine. Madison leaned close, her voice pitched low, almost kind. "Maybe she could crash on the pull-out couch in our suite. It's a bit cramped, but it might work," Daniel added. "Or there's probably a budget motel nearby. Easier than making a fuss around us." The air shifted. A couple standing to the side glanced over, their expressions flickering with recognition of humiliation. The clerk's polite professionalism only sharpened the sting. I stood rooted, the weight of eyes on me, the empty space where my name should have been laid bare for all to see. My suitcase suddenly felt heavier. Not with clothes, but with the ache of exclusion. I wheeled my suitcase a few steps away from the counter, the clerk's apology still ringing in my ears. My son had already moved on, ushering Madison and the children toward the soaring staircase that led to the guest rooms. A hotel photographer had appeared, offering complimentary family portraits for arriving guests. Daniel agreed instantly. Pulling Madison close, the children stood in front, smiling with the rehearsed ease of kids who had learned early what appearances meant. I hovered near a column, half hidden, my chest rising and falling too quickly. As the photographer adjusted his lens, Daniel leaned slightly toward Madison. His voice was low, but the words carried across the marble. "She wasn't supposed to come." The sentence cut deeper than the missing reservation. It stripped away any possibility of error, any fragile hope that this had been a simple oversight. My presence here had not been forgotten. It had been unwanted. The camera flashed, capturing a tableau of my family framed perfectly without me. Madison's lipstick smile, Daniel's proud shoulders, the children's bright eyes, an image meant to travel home on glossy paper, where I would exist only as a shadow just outside the frame. I felt the sting spread, sharp as salt in an open wound, but no tears came. Instead, I drew a breath as deep as I could manage, filling my lungs until the ache eased. My hands steadied on the suitcase handle. I refused to break in a lobby filled with strangers, refused to let the humiliation bloom into a spectacle they could dismiss as oversensitivity. The photographer lowered his camera, showing them the preview. Madison clapped her hands softly in approval. Daniel bent down to fix his son's collar. Casual, unbothered, as though his words had not lodged like a splinter in my heart. I turned away, each step deliberate. If they wanted me invisible, I would grant them that for now. But invisibility can be a shield as well as a wound. And I clutched that thought to my chest like armor as I headed toward the quieter side of the lobby. On the far side of the lobby, away from the chatter and flash of cameras, a smaller desk stood beneath a discreet sign, VIP Concierge. There was no line here. Only a young woman in a tailored jacket who looked up with immediate attention when I approached. "Good afternoon, ma'am," she said softly. "How may I help you today?" I set my suitcase beside me, reached into my purse and drew out the slim leather wallet I rarely displayed. Inside was a black card. My name, embossed beneath the logo of the Omni Heritage Group. I placed it on the counter with steady hands. "My name is Eleanor Hart," I said. "I am an executive partner with Omni Heritage, as you know. Your parent company operates under our holdings. I've encountered a problem with my reservation. The shift was instant." Her posture straightened, her eyes sharpened. She picked up the card carefully, almost reverently. "Of course." "Ms. Hart," she replied, her tone now threaded with respect. "Please allow me one moment." She tapped a private line on the phone, speaking in hushed tones. Within minutes, a man in a navy suit appeared from a side office. He was in his 50s, silver hair brushed neatly back, a name tag reading David Lang, Guest Services Manager. "Ms. Hart." He greeted warmly, extending his hand. "I apologize sincerely for the oversight. We will make this right immediately. Your comfort is our priority." I inclined my head, calm but not unkind. "I appreciate that. My family seems to have neglected certain details. I trust the resort won't." "Rest assured," he said, already signaling to the concierge. "We'll arrange accommodations that reflect your partnership. Please, follow me." As he guided me toward the private elevators, I felt the weight in my chest ease. My son might wish me erased from his picture, but the truth was written on the card in my purse, a truth that carried more authority than his whispered dismissal ever could. Mr. Lang led me past the check-in counter, away from the crowd, and toward a gilded elevator tucked behind velvet ropes. He slid a card into the reader. The doors opened with a hush. Inside, the panel glowed with buttons I had never seen in an ordinary lift. He pressed the highest one. We rose swiftly, the murmur of the lobby falling away until only the hum of the machinery remained. "I believe you'll find this accommodation suitable," he said, with a faint smile. "Our presidential suite overlooks the harbor and is reserved for our most distinguished guests." When the doors parted, I stepped into a private foyer lined with fresh orchids. A second set of doors opened into a vast living space. Sunlight streamed through floor-to-ceiling windows, casting a sheen over polished wood floors and antique armchairs upholstered in damask. Beyond the glass stretched Charleston Harbor, its waters silvered by the late afternoon light. A terrace wrapped around the suite, furnished with loungers and a small dining table, the kind of setting where one could watch ships slip quietly toward the Atlantic. Crystal vases of roses stood on side tables. Oil paintings of coastal landscapes adorned the walls. A dining room large enough for a dozen guests opened to one side, and 3 bedrooms branched off the corridor, each more sumptuous than the last. I set my suitcase near the door and walked slowly through the rooms, letting my fingers trail along the carved edges of a mahogany desk. In the master bedroom, the bedspread shimmered like silk water. I drew back the curtains and stood for a moment, breathing in the view. A smile touched my lips. Not triumphant, but steady. This was not about luxury, it was about recognition, the restoration of dignity with the simple press of a key card. I would not storm downstairs, would not raise my voice or demand apologies. When the time came, I would face Daniel not with rage, but with composure sharp enough to cut more deeply than anger ever could. I closed the balcony door behind me, the harbor wind still lingering in my hair, and began to plan how I would carry myself when we met again. That evening, the resort hosted a welcome banquet in a grand hall overlooking the water. The chandeliers glowed like captured constellations, and long tables gleamed with silverware polished to a mirror shine. Guests streamed in wearing their finest, laughter and music rising in waves. Mr. Lang met me at the elevator, offering his arm as though I were a visiting dignitary. "Allow me to escort you, Ms. Hart," he said warmly. Together we crossed the threshold, the murmur of conversation dipping for just a moment as heads turned. I saw them then, Daniel, Madison, and a handful of cousins gathered at a table near the center. Their plates sat half-filled, their voices mid-sentence, until silence swept across their group. Daniel's face drained of color. Madison's fork froze mid-air, her lipstick smile collapsing. One cousin shifted awkwardly in his chair, clearly caught between politeness and shock. Mr. Lang guided me to the empty seat at the head of their table, pulling it out with a flourish. "Miss Hart, I trust everything in your suite is satisfactory." His voice carried just enough to be overheard. "It's magnificent, thank you," I replied calmly, smoothing the napkin across my lap. The silence pressed down like a weight. "Finally," Madison spoke, her tone sugared, her eyes sharp. "A presidential suite, you said. That sounds incredible. 3 bedrooms, wasn't it? Perhaps we could, make better use of the space together. Our room is a bit cramped with the kids." Daniel gave a stiff nod, avoiding my gaze. The request hung in the air, clumsy and transparent. I met Madison's eyes evenly, my smile polite but immovable. "I'm sure the staff will be happy to assist if you'd like to explore other options. As for me, my schedule is quite full." Her smile faltered, the hint of entitlement withering. I lifted my glass of water, the clink against the stemware louder than her sigh. Around us, conversation resumed, but their stunned silence lingered, settling into the only lesson they were willing to hear. The banquet ended with the harbor lights glittering below, but I carried no appetite for their uneasy glances or half-hearted small talk. Later, back in the presidential suite, I stepped onto the private terrace. The night air smelled of salt and jasmine, soft enough to settle my restless thoughts. In the corner sat the pot of roses I had requested earlier, their petals blushing crimson against the dark. I knelt beside them, brushing soil from my fingertips as I clipped away a wilted bloom. The simple act steadied me. Roses demand care, but also respect too much handling, and they bruise. Too much neglect, and they wither. Inside, my journal lay open on the small table. I picked up the pen and let the words spill as they had waited. To love is a gift. Respect is the receipt. Without both, the purchase fails. I underlined the sentence twice, pressing the ink into the page until it nearly bled through. I paused, listening to the muffled music drifting up from the hall, imagining Daniel and Madison retreating to their suite. Their pride wounded, their silence thicker than any apology. I felt no triumph, only clarity. Family without respect is not family at all. It is a chain of obligation, clinking and heavy, dragging you down. Tonight, I had cut it loose. The harbor spread out before me, ships moving like quiet shadows across the water. I closed my journal and set it beside the vase of clipped roses. The words and petals both proof of something reclaimed. For the first time in years, I breathed without weight, pressing on my chest. If your son left you off the guest list, would you stand waiting at the desk or flash the key that proves you belong?